Well, good evening. It's great to be here with you all. The Roman philosopher Seneca and later the rock band Semisonic famously noted every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end. An increasing amount of my academic career has been spent studying beginnings and endings in the context of the employment relationship, and so I'm very excited to come talk with you all tonight about some of the findings. We tend to think of turnover as a negative ending, and that's true. Turnover does indeed have a small negative relationship with organizational performance. This means that performance tends to decrease as turnover goes up. However, the literature also suggests there's a Goldilocks effect, that too little or too much turnover is probably really bad. In the organizational sciences literature, turnover and retention are often dichotomized. We think of them as discrete states. Did they stay or did they go? However, it's better to think of employment as a continuum or a length that begins with your first day of employment and eventually ends with turnover. So retention can be thought of as the absence of turnover. Now, eventually, all retention and employment ends as a function of human mortality, the old Ponce de Leon problem. However, events and conditions at work can speed or slow progress toward turnover. Positive events and conditions slow progress toward turnover, while negative events and conditions accelerate progress toward turnover. Extrapolating a little, managers play a really important role in affecting turnover and retention, and they can either speed or slow an employee's progress toward this end. Pragmatically, you would think that managers would seek to slow turnover for those that they value, those that are productive or funny or good-looking or something, and speed it for everybody else, the less desirables. Voluntary turnover is also generally viewed as a favorable thing by the people who leave, which is why they leave. But for organizations and managers alike, turnover can be functional or dysfunctional. Distinguish between the two, it's useful to look at the party rule. Do they throw the party before or after an employee leaves? So, what precipitates voluntary turnover? Well, we know that shocks precipitate voluntary turnover for 35 to 50% of employees. And shocks are changes to the work environment of negative or positive nature that cause employees to reevaluate their employment status and look and see whether there are other alternatives out there. For the rest of everybody else, turnover is precipitated by increasing dissatisfaction with work. This accumulation of dissatisfaction that makes work less and less tenable and makes it undesirable for them to maintain employment. So there are lots of informal causes of voluntary turnover, but they all tend to be social in nature. For example, perceived or actual abuse from supervisors or coworkers, inequity or unfairness in the distribution of rewards, organizational politics, misfit to a new area or area of responsibility, for example, women on glass cliffs, and undesirable office changes. But the reasons that people stay are actually different than the reasons that they leave, and this is the purview of job embeddedness. These are the attachments that individuals maintain that keep them in an employment role. For example, the Smoky Mountains, high school kids, Dollywood, 401k vesting, all of these things have a positive impact in keeping people retained here. So it begs the question of what actions managers can take to actually affect the turnover of their employees. And this is a question that my colleagues Tim Gardner, Peter Hom, Roger Griffith, and I have sought to answer in a series of studies, specifically looking across 4 empirical studies of managers, employees, and tracking their turnover. So to answer this question, we drew on evolutionary psychology, which has an extensive discussion and dialogue about mate guarding. These are the tactics that partners use to maintain reproductive access to a desired mate. Things like putting your arm around when a rival's close by, disparaging another rival, high schoolers wearing rings, signals that they're taken. So we wanted to understand, is there a corollary in an employment context? Do managers engage in some of the same behaviors for their desired employees? And as I've noted, some turnover is functional and some is not. So we wanted to understand the tactics that they employed. So contracts can be useful from an organizational context in keeping people employed. Do not competes and non-disclosure agreements are useful by decreasing job alternatives for your employees. But the problem is that not all contracts are enforced, and this still may not keep employees from defecting to new industries. So it hurts managers in this way. In the same way, pay for performance is used as a viable mechanism to slow progress toward turnover. A clear line of sight between performance and differential compensation is a great way to motivate and retain your top talent. However, many managers don't have control over compensation, and performance evaluation systems are fraught with peril and bias. So we decided to go look at this issue ourselves, surveying over 2,000 managers across a broad variety of industries and organizations to understand what they did to guard their valued employees and keep them from leaving. We sampled their employees and tracked them across time to see whether the tactics actually worked. And ultimately, we learned 2 tactics came to the fore: nurturing and persuasion. Nurturing as a focus is always about changing the work environment and one's leadership style. So this is always adapting to the needs of whatever valued employee you're trying to keep, making their situation better. So if work relationships end because people are seeking the proverbial greener grass, this is a way of making your grass greener. Conversely, persuasion is a cognitive tactic where people use social influence to try to change someone's mind. Here, instead of changing the work environment in positive ways, the focus of persuasion is on an attempt to make other alternatives less desirable. So you're trying to change the person's mind rather than your style or the work environment. And we wanted to see what works. Well, here are the results. Our research is preliminary, but it suggests that nurturing is actually a really functional strategy for guarding valued employees. Nurturing also strengthens the positive relationship between embeddedness and retention. Conversely, persuasion is counterproductive and actually accelerates employee progress toward turnover. So ultimately, what are some key takeaways? Well, we've learned that managers exert a very important influence on retention or turnover of their subordinates, and that nurturing is the best strategy for retaining top performers. When it comes to managing retention and turnover, talk is cheap and change matters. And with that, I am happy to turn it over so that our intermission can begin. Thank you all.